Read my lips. No new taxes. That was George H.W. Bush in 1988, delivering one of the most memorable and consequential promises in modern campaign history, a phrase that helped propel him into the White House and later haunted his presidency. But Bush's America was soon shaken by events far beyond domestic tax policy. In August 1990, American forces mobilized under Operation Desert Shield, launching what would become the First Gulf War. As war played out overseas, a quieter revolution brewed at home. Economic shifts, political realignment, and a technological boom that would redefine the modern world. Historian Alan Brinkley once wrote, "The last decade of the 20th century was an interlude between the ideological struggles of the Cold War and the new insecurities of terrorism, climate change, and economic globalization."
Today on APUSH for All, we're going to dive into the 1980s, the 1990s, and get into the early 2000s, which is really one of the most transformative chapters in modern American history. We're going to unpack the election of George H.W. Bush, the Gulf War, the Clinton presidency and impeachment, and the rise of the internet economy. Also, we'll look at the contested election of 2000 and finally the 9/11 attacks and their aftermath.
We'll explore some key APUSH themes like foreign policy, the growth of conservatism, shifts within the economy, and America's place in a globalizing world. Stick with us. This one's full of twists. All right, let's start in 1988. After serving 2 terms as Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush won the presidency. His campaign carried forward the conservative momentum of the 1980s, but governing proved trickier. That now infamous tax promise, he broke it in 1990 amid a recession caused in part by a savings and loan crisis that followed a series of banking deregulations, which was touted by Reagan throughout the 80s, but kind of created a wild, wild west in the banking industry that ultimately led to a bit of a boom and bust. Rising oil prices following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but ultimately that shakes up global markets, which causes consumer confidence to fall. There's rising costs, consumer debt, unemployment. And pretty soon, government revenue is going to fall, deficits grow, and economic stagnation loomed. The Bush administration is facing pressure from both Wall Street and Congress to do something to stabilize the economy. And this is ultimately going to lead to a budget deal with Democrats that damage his support with conservatives.
The famous quote from Hamilton the musical is coming into my mind: winning is easy, governing is harder.
Good one.
Yeah,
Love that.
yeah. Um, this is a classic example, APUSH students, of continuity and change. Bush promised continuity with Reagan's small government vision, but the changing economic realities of the 90s are going to force him to break from that. This early 90s recession is going to lead to increased deficit concerns, something that students might see in a causation style SAQ, DBQ, or LAQ.
All right. So in January 1991, the United States launched Operation Desert Storm. Saddam Hussein, like I always think of Dana Carvey saying, Saddam Hussein, he's trying to do the George H.W. Bush thing. Um,
And Dana Carvey is Saturday Night Live did a great impression, which you did a great impression
well,
as well.
I wouldn't say the word great, but anyhow, Saddam Hussein. Invasion of Kuwait was met with a massive U.S. led coalition. I think that whole thing took like 11 minutes
A
to
hundred hours.
okay, or 11 minutes, either one. The Gulf War lasted only 42 days. The ground war was over in 100 hours.
What I
Where's the 11-minute part? I just made that part up. I'm so sorry. And U.S. technological dominance was on full display. Airstrikes, you had smart bombs, you had satellite guided missiles. It was a clear demonstration of America's post Cold War military power.
But despite military success, Bush's domestic approval tanks. The recession lingered, and by 1992, a new challenger emerged, Bill Clinton. Can I get a hello from Bill Clinton?
Hello. Yeah, that was just your standard.
I thought that, maybe.
Well, how about, I have to think of something he
Oh,
said,
I
like
feel your
something like,
pain. I feel your pain.
I feel your pain. I feel your pain.
And tell us,
That's more like it. That's
Yeah.
more like it.
tell us what political party you are and where you're from.
I'm a Democrat from the great state of Arkansas.
Nice. And
I was also a Rhodes Scholar. Pretty
yeah,
smart guy. Yeah.
yeah. And Bill Clinton, he's going to promise economic renewal amidst this, economic crisis that starts under HW's presidency, and he is also going to promise renewal and a third way, quote, third way between liberalism and conservatism. And famously, Clinton's going to zero in on Americans' economic anxieties when he offered the phrase, or not him, but his political advisor, James Carville, said, "It's the economy, stupid." And oftentimes we still hear that today with any major election, and I think that had a lot to do with the election we just had in November, right? When the economy isn't going people's way and it's hurting people's pockets, that is definitely going to be a huge determining factor in the outcome of the election.
And it's so, like in the 11th hour, where we've seen this so often. I always think back at when McCain and Obama are running, and McCain is driving on this, like, senatorial legendary experience that he had, Vietnam vet, and it's all about national security and his experience and everything, and all of the gravitas that he brings to, or what he would bring to the presidency. And then the 11th hour, October, all Obama has to say is, to borrow a phrase from Carville, it's the economy, stupid, or hope, change. Everything crashed, and and McCain is over here going, but wait, it was about all of this stuff. It's not about that anymore. It's about the economy.
Yeah. And we also have a third party candidate in this election of 1992, and that was a guy by the name of Ross Perot.
Yeah, Ross Perot.
Perot, big Texas guy. Well, no, he wasn't big Texas guy. He was little Texas guy.
But he had big ears.
He had big ears.
Famously.
Well, let's not comment on anybody's body.
Well, it was a popular trait that he had that people enjoyed.
We can make fun of his voice though,
Yeah.
because he would say, like, "Can I talk? Can I talk? You know that Lord? You know that big sucking sound that you hear? That's Jobs going to Mexico." And that's exactly what he said about
That might be your best impression.
That was good.
But he was responding to NAFTA, and something that you guys are going to probably touch on here in a second.
Yeah, and he becomes the most. Isn't he the highest performing third party candidate ever in American history?
Oh,
That's a good trivia question.
I would great question. I don't know.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
I think he got 19% of the popular vote, and before him, it would have been Teddy Roosevelt for the Bull Moose Party in the election of 1912, and I think he did not get 19.
George Wallace won what, like
he won 5 states.
5 states. So I don't know how many states. I don't think Perot won that many states.
But 19% is a chunk.
Yeah,
man. That's a huge chunk. Yeah.
Yeah. And remember he had those giant charts that he would hold up.
That's right.
We've seen a lot more of that today with people holding up charts.
Right.
Right. Okay, so Clinton's presidency. It's a real shift because ultimately, yes, he is a Democrat, but he is not a New Deal Democrat in the way that we think about Lyndon Johnson, JFK. No, Clinton is offering, as Ms. Keltner said, a third way, a new way to think about the Democratic Party. And he quickly comes out of the gate demonstrating this when he signed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in 1993, which was really a move toward globalization. Even though many labor groups are going to oppose this, NAFTA eliminates tariffs, trade barriers between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And this is really an agreement that Clinton will inherit from George H.W. Bush. But he's going to push for it really hard and get it through a Democratic-controlled Congress with bipartisan support from many Republicans.
Wow. You don't hear that said every day. But yeah, so Clinton frames this as a win for the global economy, saying NAFTA means jobs, American jobs, and good paying American jobs. But as you pointed out, Dr. Garrison, opposition from labor especially was fierce. Groups like the AFL-CIO warned that it would outsource American manufacturing jobs to Mexico, where wages and environmental standards were lower, costing companies a lot less money. And they were partially right. Many U.S. factories closed or moved, especially in the Rust Belt, accelerating deindustrialization.
Can we just clarify this for our listeners a little bit, because I think this is so timely, right? With kind of this tariff war that we have going on right now. Why and how is NAFTA so damaging to American manufacturing? I know we hit on it a little bit, but can we clarify that just a little bit more for our audience?
Yeah, so what NAFTA was hoping to do was to make it easier for the United States and its most immediate neighbors to avoid things like protective tariffs, to just open free trade, which is a very laissez-faire principle. And theoretically, the idea is that if you have increased trade and production, the market is going to decide the best way, most efficient way to produce those goods, and that will increase overall production, lower costs. Everybody wins. But from the United States perspective, and this is why many unions are going to push back against this, you're basically making it difficult to produce certain kinds of goods in America anymore. It's going to become too costly relative to what you could do if you went to Canada or Mexico. And a lot of unions saw the writing on the wall. And I think if you look at the overall data, this is another kick to the teeth in labor unions and leads to a greater decrease in labor union participation. And it really is not something that you would have expected from a Democrat up to this point.
So, in other words, I mean, we could kind of boil this down to America was treating its workers in a way that was almost too good to keep costs down, and so outsourcing those labor type manufacturing jobs to other places where workers weren't treated as well is going to save companies lots of money.
Right. And I think when you kind of frame it in today's terms, it's incredible to think that people like Reagan, people that were operatively conservative at the time, would be so overwhelmingly supportive of free trade. They were free, all the way through. And now we have the current administration that is, yes, Republican, but it's really interesting to see how that's turned, and it's so tariff heavy, which is the anathema of what NAFTA was. God, say that 10 times real quick.
Mm.
The anathema of NAFTA.
Yeah.
Anathema. See, I can't even do it twice. But it's weird how that's happened.
Yeah, and so what we're being told now is that these tariff wars are basically trying to reverse the effects of things like NAFTA.
Yeah. And it's no surprise that there's some there's companies out there who are really concerned about these tariffs because of what it's going to do to their production costs. But from a worker's perspective, tariffs can be protective. It can offer a way to bring back jobs. I mean, the question is the United States, because of things like NAFTA, so global in its economy that you can't just press a button and suddenly those jobs will reappear? We're not talking about jobs that disappeared a couple years ago. We're talking about since the 1950s. This
Right.
has been going on. It's a really complicated question. So complicated, in fact, it might be leading to some realignment with our major political parties.
Yep.
So again, 90s, big deal. NAFTA, big deal. It's the globalization of the U.S. economy. It shows Clinton's role as a centrist and talking about the markets and the importance of free markets. And this really, again, I think we have to reemphasize, it goes against what the Democratic Party had been for most of the 20th century.
Yeah, and NAFTA was just one piece of a larger puzzle. Clinton also is going to push to bring the U.S. deeper into the global economy by supporting the creation of something called the World Trade Organization in 1995. And the WTO, World Trade Organization, replaced the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. I know we all know that as
Of
GATT.
course. Yeah.
GATT.
Yeah.
And the WTO now is going to establish enforceable rules for international commerce. So, again, like the key theme here is globalization of the American economy.
The WTO gave the US greater access to foreign markets, but again, it comes with this cost. These global trade rules often favored corporate interest over labor. So these labor protections start to be chipped away. And under Clinton, the US economy started to shift pretty dramatically. We go more toward the tech and service sectors, which we can clearly see is a continuation happening today, while manufacturing jobs continue this decline. It's a pattern that shaped the economic anxiety of the 2000s and really up until the present
So
moment.
you can really see a kind of a point of demarcation from what we could call maybe the old world order that was governed completely by the Cold War system. Thomas Friedman brings this up in a book called The Lexus and the Olive Tree. And what he does is he uses all of these metaphors to compare the old world system to the new world system, Cold War to globalization. And in it, he says things like the old system was the symbol was the wall, the Berlin Wall, and whereby everything is divided into two, and you have two major these behemoth uh, superpowers that are in charge. The symbol of globalization would be the web, where everyone's connected and no one's in charge.
Wow.
Wow, Mr. Hill, you're smart.
Listen,
Somebody reads books.
listen. I
Oh,
read a few books in my day. I'm older than these other two people. That means I read more books, I guess. I don't know.
great reference.
So it was the age of globalization, products, ideas, and jobs moving easier across borders faster than ever. For some Americans, it meant opportunity. For others, especially those in traditional industries, it meant uncertainty.
So, along with NAFTA and the World Trade Organization and Clinton kind of, doing things that had not traditionally been done by Democrats, he's also going to, go the other way with some welfare reform, which might be one of the most controversial bipartisan bills of the 1990s was Clinton's welfare reform bill. And just so, our students are clear and our audience is clear, welfare would be government programs that give money, food, housing, or other help to people who are struggling to meet basic needs. So Clinton comes in, and in 1996, he's going to sign the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. He chose a long one. And it's going to end a New Deal era program that had been put in place to help with welfare. That was called the Aid to Families with Dependent Children Act. And that is going to now be replaced by the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. That'll be just one program underneath that long act I said earlier.
If you thought that you were done with alphabet soup after the New Deal, I mean, doesn't this show that the popularity of creating acronyms out of government programs starts in the 1930s and we still
It's like education. Education loves acronyms too.
exactly
Yeah,
good?
and to kind of swivel it a little further, it is New Deal esque in its names, but it's really kind of unlike the New Deal. It's kind of clipping the wings of social welfare, not expanding it. So Clinton says, "Today we are ending welfare as we know it."
And to contextualize this even more, welfare had become almost a dirty word in national politics. If you think about it, the word welfare, if you said and put it in a sentence, I'm going to improve the welfare of people around me, everybody would be like, oh, that's great.
Yeah,
That's
right.
a good thing to do. But the connotation becomes so um, uh, denigrated by during the 1980s. The concept of welfare queens,
Yes.
this idea that if you were on welfare, it was you were lazy, that you were just abusing the system, becomes so widespread and ubiquitous that Clinton decides to really shift away from that and to say, well, look, we're actually creating something new, and that's why this welfare reform bill is put into place. It put strict time limits on benefits, no more than 5 years total, and required most recipients to begin working within 2 years. It also gave states much more control over how welfare funds were spent. So, a little bit of a major shift in federalism, go all the way back to our colonial and early American Republic units there.
True that. At the same time, Clinton also stated in 1996, the era of big government is over, but we can't go back to a time when our citizens were just left to fend for themselves. We will meet them by going forward as one America, by working together in our communities, our schools, our churches and synagogues, our workplaces, across the entire spectrum of our civic life. Man, it's exhausting trying to do Clinton. He's so breathy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that quote, I think it really shows Clinton's centrist vision. The fact that he's saying the era of big government, it's over. As a Democrat, he's saying that, but he's saying we've got to have a little something in there. So he's mixing personal responsibility, which is something probably that would have been more characteristic of Republican ideology, with community support, something that would have been more characteristic of more Democrat ideology. And this is going to define the politics of the 1990s. And just like anything else, there are going to be supporters of this and there's going to be critics of this. Supporters praise Clinton for promoting personal responsibility and reducing welfare rolls, which it did, at least temporarily. But critics argued that it failed to address the structural causes of poverty and that millions of people, especially single mothers, were pushed into low wage, unstable jobs without long term support. The 1994 midterms were a turning point in American political history. Newt Gingrich and the GOP, stands for the Grand Old Party, the Republican Party, swept Congress with the Contract with America, which pushed a conservative legislative agenda and marked the first time Republicans controlled both chambers of Congress in 40 years, so both the House and the Senate. And while not every item in the contract with America became law, it did have major effects. So, first of all, it defined the Republican Party's message for a generation starting in 94. It also forced President Clinton to shift to the center, which is something he was already doing. But again, like that welfare thing we just talked about, that was 96. So, this is in 94. So, you can kind of see the effects of this. And then it also intensified partisan polarization that we see playing out today, laying the groundwork for future political gridlock in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and then of course today. And it really leads to this like us versus them mentality of, thinking of political parties as almost teams that you're blindly supporting no matter what they do or no matter what they say, which is not entirely healthy for a democracy.
Yeah, I think it's important to note we've last couple episodes especially we've talked about that technology will hit at a certain moment. We talked about MTV and we talked about cable television, or we talked about TV during the civil rights movement. So here again, something happens in the early 90s at this exact moment when politics are starting to become more polarized, and that's the rise of the 24-hour news cycle and cable news shows that were just nothing but bombard you with political commentary, this is when you had the two guests, one would be liberal, one would be Republican. They'd start yelling at each other, and suddenly this became really entertaining stuff. You also had the rise of some media figures who would begin to become larger than life, and I'm thinking specifically of Rush Limbaugh, who, by the way, um, from Cape Girardeau, just south of here, Cape Girardeau, right next to Jackson.
Your neighbor.
Your neck of the
Yeah.
woods, baby.
And when in high school, I had a buddy and I had a little painting company. It's called G Money Painting. Pretty good name.
I hope you guys were paying your taxes.
Who knows? A lot of things got done under the table. Who's to say?
Who
knows?
One time that we got hired to paint, this is no joke, a picket fence, just like
So you and Tom Sawyer.
just like Tom Sawyer. And it turned out that the owner of the house let us know that it was the childhood home of Rush Limbaugh. How about that?
Wow.
Wow.
And Limbaugh started off as a disc jockey in Cape. And I think it's fair to say that through his family connections, he eventually became more and more popular, in large part because he did have this bombastic, loud, aggressive take on the politics of the day, and that proved really popular in this particular moment in time.
And we see that, what any network you go on today, whether it's Fox News or CNN, anytime I want to be entertained, not informed, I will turn on these 24-hour networks and just kind of flip between, both of them or MSNBC and be entertained. So the point is not to be informed, but entertained. So remember that. And this, hyper partisanship and this polarization, it's gonna lead to something pretty significant in the 90s, which is Clinton's impeachment.
Right. The impeachment is really like a 24-hour story that people just can't get enough of. it all stems from this affair that Clinton has with a young White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. But the real problem is that Clinton uh, lied essentially under oath, commits perjury, uh, some obstruction of justice, and impeachment was brought by the House. He was acquitted by the Senate. And even despite this, though, Clinton remains pretty popular. In large part, this is because the economy was absolutely booming, and we're starting to see the impact of this thing called the internet and the .com era.
And just as a reminder to our audience, impeachment does not mean removal from office. Impeachment means charges are brought against you. You then have to go into a trial in the Senate, and Clinton gets um,
Acquitted.
acquitted. Thank you.
Yeah, you were there.
And it's really incumbent upon the Senate to define what they interpret to be high crimes and misdemeanors.
Yeah.
So it's that part of it is really subjective.
Yeah. It's not what we think of as a actual court
Right.
of law.
Right.
Right. Thanks, founders, for making it really vague in the Constitution.
Wah, wah.
So, we talked about the economic issues of the early 90s, but now we're in the mid to late 90s and stock markets are soaring. Unemployment hit record lows. Tech companies like Amazon and eBay were born, but it wasn't all perfect. Y2K, also known as, the year 2000, the fear that computers would crash. I remember this, even though I was a kid. I remember people being concerned that computers would crash on January 1st, 2000, that the technology wouldn't be able to handle the switch from 1999 on your date on your computer to 2000, and it really symbolized the anxieties of the world going into the digital age.
And people mock this, but now it's easy to mock it in hindsight. At the time, people were kind of freaked out.
People were like hunkering down. They were like, "Okay, we've dug the bomb shelter. Now it's time to use it. We're gonna like stick all stuff because like okay, the whole world is gonna melt or something when the clock strikes 12:01 or whatever."
I think it was most people had a very vague understanding of what computers even were and what
Right.
the internet was, and so it didn't take much to create a little bit of chaos.
So Bill Clinton sent the very first presidential email, but only two total while he was in office. That's amazing to me to think that that happened not until the 1990s.
Yeah.
That is
Late 90s.
unbelievable.
Late 90s, yeah.
That is incredible. And so one of the emails that he sent was to astronaut John Glenn on the space shuttle in 1998, and the other was to U.S. troops in the Adriatic.
And there's a great photo of Clinton sending that email to John Glenn, and he looks he looks like he has no idea what he's doing.
Yeah, no one really understood it. I mean, it's like I guess it was probably like the first time someone tried to explain how a telephone worked. And like, wait, what?
Right.
Like, you talk. How does that? No one had any idea.
So one of the jobs that I had before even I worked for the Pillsbury Company as an account executive is I sold Minolta copiers and fax machines in Kansas City at a dealership, and explaining it to my mom about she's like, okay, so you pick up a phone and you can feed a piece of paper into a slot into this phone mechanism, and you can dial a number like you were going to pick up the phone and talk to somebody, and on the other end if they hit a button they can receive the same piece of paper on the other end with I'm like, well, okay, it's not the same piece of paper but yes. And she's like, Michael, how does that work? I just please explain. I go, there's like, I don't know, there's like wires involved. I don't know, Mom. I'm just trying to sell them. But it kind of blows your mind.
Yeah.
Even stuff that is pretty antiquated now, it's I don't know how that stuff works.
Yeah, I mean, and who knows? It's like when our students trying to explain TikTok to us. Like, look, we don't.
Oh, yeah, they were just trying to tell us what reel we should do next on Instagram, and we're all like, "What? This guy does what? And you want us to like dip our face in a bowl of ice water with lemon?
Little
People
teaser.
are watching that? Like, what?
Little teaser. I like how you did that. You dropped
Yeah.
that in.
Okay, boomer."
So we've got all these economic booms and technological change. Clinton is really kind of laying low after his impeachment, and that gets us to the election of 2000. I would say
Dun dun dun.
the most. I think it's the most infamous election in American history.
Well, certainly in
It's up there.
Modern, yeah.
memory, but those of us who live in the past, I would say it's not. But definitely for non-nerds like us.
Yeah.
Okay. Real quick. Here's what happens. The Democrat Al Gore, who was Clinton's vice president, he wins the popular vote, but the Electoral College hinged, go figure, on Florida, and a messy recount is going to follow. This goes back and forth in the courts. It gets pretty crazy. No one knows who's president. It took months, right? No one had any idea how this was going to play out. And ultimately, it's going to take the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore to step in, and ultimately they're going to rule that the recount has to end, and the election, Florida goes to Bush, which effectively makes him president.
And this is where we also get Chads.
Chads,
Hanging
yeah.
Chads.
Hanging Chads and pregnant Chads.
Phrase of the episode. Phrase of the episode. Hanging Chads.
Very good.
And
no, just one. Just one. We can't confuse it.
Okay.
ASMR it.
Hanging Chad. Now that was
Well,
weak.
we're not going to hang.
Well,
hanging Chad.
Listen, just hey! If you know somebody who's named Chad that's listening out there, they are not in danger right now. Nobody's coming after Chad. It's a ballot thing. Okay, so hanging Chad. Okay,
Hanging Chads.
Chads.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a lot of Chads.
Okay, there are a lot. Oh, now you're threatening more people. I see how it is.
Hanging Chads.
Ooh, that was velvety.
You want me to explain it?
Explain.
You're mouthing explain it to me. Sure. So they would go in, and you'd have to do this little paper push thing, and it would push the little hole into the ballot.
You used a metal stylus.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
you
You
punch
push
a hole.
hole punch. That's
Yeah,
what I was
yeah,
looking
yeah,
for.
yeah.
You would hole punch, and then the computer would read. These early computers would read your vote. The problem was we're dealing with humans, and a lot of people.
And humans in Florida, that many of whom
Right.
were blue hairs.
That's you got
Sorry for the blue
a
hairs.
lot of older folks, and who we deeply respect and venerate.
We just don't want to alienate anybody.
No. We welcome. Yeah, it just means that if you have a little weakness in your hand, or maybe you're trying to move too quick, uh, you, you are unable to fully push through the piece of paper, and that gives you what they call a Chad, right? And the question was, how many of these ballots were that had been pushed too hard, right? Right?
Right. What was a valid ballot?
Right.
What did that look like?
A valid Chad.
Valid ballot, Chad.
Right.
Okay.
We could send emails back and forth, from the Earth to John Glenn in space, but we could not figure out
No.
the
How to
ballots.
push through a
And
metal thing through a little piece of
They
paper.
had to look at each one. A Republican and a Democrat had to sit there and decide whether or not it was an actual vote or if it was a hanging Chad. How do you figure this out? Ultimately, the Supreme Court has to step in, which makes it such a controversial election.
And so Justice John Paul Stevens, in his scathing dissent of Bush v. Gore, says this: although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner, the loser is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law.
Let's hit that.
So historical context, intended audience, public author's purpose, author.
Mr. Hill, are you okay?
Hanging Chad, author's point of view. Okay, so what are we going to go with? Which one?
Let's do his purpose.
Okay,
Yeah, sure.
I think what he is. I'll take a crack at this. Okay, I think his purpose here is warning the public that, and he's a part of the Supreme Court, but he's in the dissent. This was a 5-4 decision, and what he's saying is like, this is a warning. This is a shot across the bow for the future of our Supreme Court, getting away from what the framers intended the Supreme Court to be. And little caveat here, little historical context, if you will, if you want to go that way. John Paul Stevens, also pretty left-leaning guy. He also wanted to add an amendment to the Constitution that would eliminate gerrymandering. I think a lot of people would be like, oh, okay, I'm interested in that. He was also a huge advocate of overturning Citizens United in 2010 that would get, big money out of campaigning. And so he had some opinions, that's
But
for sure.
he was basically saying that, the loser in this whole debacle is the American people, American democracy, because this decision was purely along party lines, 5 to
Yes.
4. So, he's worried. We've been talking about this polarization. Judges are supposed to be nonpartisan. And this is what he was saying. But, Al Gore, he steps aside. And we have this peaceful transition of power from Clinton to George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush. And certainly the first, major test of Bush's presidency is going to be the attacks on September 11th of 2001, when terrorists from the group Al Qaeda hijacked 4 planes, one crashing into the World Trade Center, another into the Pentagon, 2 into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and then 1 which was taken down by its passengers in a field in Pennsylvania. And on that day, nearly 3,000 people died, and it was the deadliest terrorist attack in U.S. history.
One question that you should immediately be asking is, well, why? Why did these terrorists single out the United States? Ultimately, it's a very, very complicated question, but we can reduce it down to this notion that Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al Qaeda, opposed U.S. support for Israel, was upset about military presence in Saudi Arabia, including, you can go back to the first Gulf War, and American overall involvement in Middle Eastern affairs. So ultimately, 9/11 launched this war of terror.
And so President George W. Bush addressed the nation that night, and he said, terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America.
The effects of 9/11, though, go way beyond that single day. In the name of national security, we get the U.S. Patriot Act, which was passed just weeks later, and it gave the government all these new power to conduct surveillance, detain suspects, monitor all kinds of communication. Some praised it for quickly stepping up to protect Americans in this new era, but others warned that it risked violating civil liberties.
Also, another effect of the 9/11 attacks was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And this merged 22 federal agencies, from border security to emergency response, all to prevent coordination, or not to prevent coordination, but to achieve coordination against future attacks. And airport security changed as well. This is when we get the creation of the TSA, Transportation Security Administration. And, you used to be able to just walk into an airport and go to your gate, and now we know that you have to get there much earlier and go through all of these steps to actually be able to fly.
And you get to take off your shoes, which everybody's a big fan of.
Yeah.
Not if you have pre-check like me.
Easy now, Miss Privilege over
Yeah,
here.
no kidding.
Okay.
Wave it in our
Alright.
faces.
Wow. Well, I will not wave my shoes in your guys' faces.
No, nor will I.
Yeah. So, I mean, my socks are and shoes are clean, but nobody wants to take off their shoes in the airport. I'm just saying.
Let's keep it moving, Mr. Hill.
Ain't nobody want that. Okay. Oh, well, then, of course, there was the war. First, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan to go after Al Qaeda and the Taliban. Then came Iraq in 2003 based on claims of weapons of mass destruction that were never found. These wars lasted for decades, costing trillions of dollars and thousands of American and civilian lives.
Yeah, speaking of those weapons of mass destruction, it's interesting that you saw President Trump openly criticize the Iraqi war, despite the fact that it was his own party that led the country into that war. It won't be long after that a Republican President Trump will say that those weapons never existed. It was a huge mistake, and we shouldn't have gone in the first place. But 9/11 ultimately had this huge cultural impact. It changed how Americans viewed the world and how the world viewed America. There was a rise of Islamophobia. There was increased suspicion of immigrants and questions about how much freedom we should give up for safety.
The political divide deepened too. National security became a major wedge issue. Some Americans supported the wars and the surveillance, others protested, especially as the wars dragged on.
In short, 9/11 didn't just launch the war on terror, it really reshaped American politics, culture, and identity in ways we're still living with today.
90s may feel like ancient history to some, but the legacy is alive today. The political
That is tricky because Riley had to say that earlier.
yeah, she messed it up first, I think.
Like
That kind of messed me up.
political
Hey.
polarization.
Political polarization that intensified with Clinton's impeachment, that's only deepened.
And the 2000 election set the stage for questions about democracy, voting rights, and trust in the Supreme Court, issues, of course, we're still grappling with in 2025.
The war on terror, surveillance powers, airport security all date back to 9/11. And the debate over privacy versus security is as relevant now as it was then, especially with AI. Not A1,
Not
but
A1.
AI and big data in the mix.
Economically, the 90s saw the birth of the internet age. I mean, the 90s were awesome. I'll just say that. I think the 90s were awesome. At least if you liked computers and the internet and the economy and all that stuff. Our economy, our media, our politics, so much of it is shaped by the decisions made in that moment.
And as global tensions rise again right now, from the Middle East to Eastern Europe, the post Cold War optimism of the 90s feels far away. So here is a question for our listeners: can a nation founded on ideals of liberty and democracy maintain its unity in an era of rapid technological change and global crises?
Deep.
Mm.
All right, this has gone on incredibly long. This is our longest podcast ever, but I know it's what the people want, so I'm glad we can
what the people
provide.
want.
But let's go ahead and wrap it up. We'd like to thank our sponsors.
Junior Java, a student led coffee and tea company with a mission to make education more equitable worldwide. Every purchase helps support kids in need. Fuel your studies and support a great cause. Check out juniorjavacoffee.com to shop and learn more.
Thanks, Junior Java, for keeping us and history brewing.
Last week, it just did not have that same sound when Garrison did it.
It wasn't the same.
Good job. We would also like to give big thanks to Cats of Family Dentistry, Scrawny Arms Farm, the Healthcare Group for Women, and Right on Ruben Schlansky College Essay Tutoring. As always, we are honored by their support.
Thanks for tuning in to APUSH for All. If you like this episode, be sure to just subscribe on Spotify, Apple iTunes, YouTube. Leave us a review. If you got a topic you want us to cover, send us a message on Instagram at APUSH for All.
Until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.